Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. I hope everybody's having a beautiful day. I hope the sun is shining. I hope the birds are singing and the wind is at your back. I got a great show for you today. The one and only, the legendary Dr. Bryan Roth, the Michael Hooker Distinguished Professor of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as well as a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. The Roth Lab, the man behind it, has an incredible team of people working with him, a long-standing interest in the design, engineering, and evolution of proteins for designated functions. The Roth Lab perfected the chemogenetic technology they have named DREAD, designer receptor exclusively activated by designer drugs. This technology has afforded thousands of labs worldwide the opportunity to discover how cell type specific modulation of signaling is translated into behavior and non-behavioral outcomes. Dr. Bryan, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm
Happy
living
to be here.
Fantastic. Looks like you're over on the West Coast. Is that accurate?
Yeah, today I am in Oregon. Yeah,
Nice.
So I spend part-time here in Oregon. I'm on the coast. I don't know if you can see. It's a little cloudy out there. I would turn the thing around, but you can see the ocean out there. There are whales out there cavorting in the waves and everything. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah. What an amazing time to be out there in Oregon when you get to see the decriminalization of medicinal mushrooms happening out there.
Yeah. Psilocybin is now legal in Oregon.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. Did you ever think that day would come when you started working on psychedelics back in the 80s?
Never. No. I never imagined it. I never thought that these would ever, that psychedelic drugs and other drugs of abuse, basically drugs of abuse or use, would ever find therapeutic indications. But here we are. It's a new era, right?
Yeah, it is a new era. It reminds me, so much of our research and discovering novel ideas comes from language. And I know in a previous podcast, you had spoken to Nick about the terminology and the language we use, whether it's terming new things or in a heightened state of awareness. It seems that we find ourselves with experiences that are ineffable. We don't have the words to describe them. And I'm wondering, how does that play out? Like when you are trying to find novel compounds, what's the relationship with novel compounds and language?
So I don't think about that too much, to be honest with you.
Right.
But what I've noticed, so let me just sort of address this from a historical perspective. Okay.
Please.
I think that might be the best. So before we had the word psychedelic, there was the term psychoactive. And psychoactive was a term that was coined, I think, in the early 50s for drugs like LSD. So LSD was known in the 50s. Amphetamines are psychoactive, and so on. And it was just sort of a general term for drugs that modify the brain. And so ethanol would be a psychoactive drug. Alcohol, for instance, nicotine is a psychoactive drug. I think in the middle 50s, there was the suggestion that the term psychedelic be used for drugs like LSD and mescaline. So at that time, LSD and mescaline were the only known psychedelic drugs. And so they were distinguished from other psychoactive drugs that were known at the time, which include all the ones I mentioned, along with marijuana. At the time, the active ingredient of marijuana was actually not known to be THC, and ibogaine as well. So ibogaine was also something that was known at the time. And the person who invented the term psychedelic had actually sampled all of those compounds. So they were they were all legal in the 50s. You could probably order them from a chemical supply house. And he felt, and others felt, that had taken, most of the people in that era had taken LSD. They hadn't taken psilocybin. And he felt that that these drugs like LSD were unique in that they had this mind sort of expanding or mind revealing aspect to them. And when I got in the field of, when I started studying psychedelic drugs and their receptors in the early 80s, this had expanded somewhat. So there were in psychoactive drugs, now we had drugs that were stimulants. So these are drugs like amphetamine, cocaine, caffeine is a stimulant. We had sedative hypnotic drugs, anxiolytics. These are drugs like Valium, benzodiazepines, things like that. And then we had psychedelic drugs. Then we had hallucinogens. So among hallucinogens would have been considered psychedelics. So these consisted of LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, and their analogs, which all mediated their effects through a single receptor in the brain, particular serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. So those were all considered psychedelic drugs. And then we had other hallucinogens that like ketamine, which are dissociative anesthetic agents by nature. So ketamine, PCP. So PCP and ketamine, pretty much the same mechanism of action, different duration of action, different sort of intensity of action, but both have the same basic effect. And then we had drugs like scopolamine from Amanita muscarina, which is another type of hallucinogenic mushroom. And these are technically drugs that cause a delirium. So I'm a physician, and delirium is something that is completely different from a psychedelic experience. So in delirium, by definition, people are not oriented to space and time or even person. And when people take psychedelics, if you ask them where they are, they still basically know where they are. They know the date. They know who they are. And that's not the case with drugs that induce a delirium. And then we have this other interesting class of drugs called oneirogens. We now call them oneirogens. And these are drugs that induce a dreamlike state. And these are drugs like ibogaine and salvinorin A, which comes from the plant Salvia divinorum. And then there's another class of drugs completely separate from hallucinogens that we call entactogens or empathogens. And these are drugs like MDMA or ecstasy. So up until, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I would say this was the standard language that we use to describe these drugs. And then something happened. So now if you go to the popular literature and even among scientists, many of the drugs that I discussed, so ketamine, the psychedelics, even ecstasy, are considered to be psychedelics. But ordinarily we would just call those psychoactive drugs. But it's what I mentioned to others is that in the future it will basically depend on how people use these terms. So if everybody in the world except for me decides that psychedelics include ketamine, ecstasy, LSD, salvia, ibogaine, scopolamine, and they refer to those, then those will be psychedelics, basically. And then we would have basically serotonergic psychedelics. So these are drugs like LSD and, then others. And it's a continual, I wouldn't say battle, but continual conversation I have with people that, up until recently, all these drugs had a different meaning. And actually, if you look at how the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, and the European Medicines Association classifies drugs, and how pharmacologists classify drugs, basically, they use the classification scheme that I use. So it's so I don't know what to do, basically.
Well, it's an interesting relationship to think how one influences the other. Like, it seems to me that there would be lots of pressure to call this certain class psychedelics if all this class is being layered into a therapy in a retreat somewhere. Like, I could see a business interest wanting it that way.
It's a sexy term.
Sure.
It didn't used to be sexy. So before 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't use the term psychedelic in my papers. I used the term hallucinogen. Basically because it wasn't considered it was just not in common use. It was generally more appropriate to consider them hallucinogens, and most people didn't really get this, psychedelic versus non-psychedelic thing. So so I think MAPS in particular. So there's this company, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, probably have the biggest footprint in this area, and they actually don't study psychedelics. They study most of their work is based on ecstasy,
right? And
ecstasy is not even a hallucinogen. So I've never taken it, but I've talked with a large number of people who've taken ecstasy, and it's really more like it has a sort of a stimulant action. So people enjoy dancing, and then also this action of increasing empathy, basically, and a feeling of connectedness. So I like the term empathogen. But really, drugs like ecstasy really is really closer in action to amphetamine. The big difference between ecstasy and, say, methamphetamine, for instance, is that ecstasy promotes the release of multiple neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, to a great extent serotonin. So it's a very strong serotonin releaser, but also releases lots and lots of dopamine and norepinephrine. Whereas methamphetamine is pretty selective for dopamine, as is cocaine. But they basically have identical mechanisms of action, and differ in their subjective effects. And that's the same for cocaine and amphetamine. Cocaine and amphetamine have different objective effects, but you wouldn't call cocaine a psychedelic, right?
Right. Agreed.
I mean, nobody would. So it's, I think my guess is it's branding.
Sure.
And PR and this sort of thing.
Yep.
But the thing about it is, because of the way language works, if people use the term to include all those drugs, then they're all psychedelics, basically, by definition. It'd be like if I decided to call the color green Gorn, okay, if I made up this term Gorn.
Right.
And if everybody in the world agreed with me, then it would be Gorn. It would no longer be green.
Right. The truth is what people agree on, right? It's a perceived reality.
For language.
Yeah. This kind of ties into the subjective effects of classic psychedelics. Like, it's very difficult to measure what's happening in there, right? When we rely on these subjective terms, but it seems that in your lab, you've figured out some ways to really figure out, like, maybe you can explain some of the testing you're doing in there to really understand what's happening. Like, is it really connecting to the 2A, or is it this new TrkB going in there? Or what's the mechanism of action that you've seen of lately in some of the new papers coming out with the serotonin receptors and classic psychedelics?
Yeah. So in terms of the psychedelic actions,
Mm-hmm.
so when somebody takes LSD, they have a psychedelic experience. That's immediately, that's what they, for the next 12 to 18 hours, basically.
Right.
And same with psilocybin or mescaline or DMT. And so there's no question that the psychedelic experience is mediated by activation of a single receptor in the brain. That's the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. And the reason that that's known with great certainty is that human studies have been done primarily by Franz Vollenweider's group at Switzerland, starting in the 80s. So I think his first, or 98, I think his first paper was published in 1998 on this. And what he showed was that if he pre-treated humans with a drug that blocks 5-HT2A receptors and then administered LSD or psilocybin, the effects were gone, basically. And similar studies are done and have similar experiments have been done in animal studies, basically showing the same thing. And in mice, you can genetically delete the 5-HT2A receptor and the psychedelic drug-like actions are gone, basically. So I think there's no question at all that the psychedelic effects are mediated by the 5-HT2A receptor. The question comes, though, how is this related to the potential therapeutic actions of these drugs? Mm. So we have the best data for therapy for psilocybin. There are now, I think, 2 or maybe 3 fairly well-controlled phase 2, what are called phase 2 clinical trials with psilocybin. Small number of patients still. But what they showed was that either 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin was effective at treating depression for periods ranging from 24 days to a year, basically, depending on the follow-up in the particular study. And of course, the beneficial effects of psilocybin occur after the psychedelic experience is over. And so the question has arisen, are the beneficial effects mediated through psilocybin, activating something downstream of the 5-HT2A receptor, or is it some other target in the brain? And there's a huge debate about this right now. There was recently a paper, I think you're probably referring to, suggesting that this growth factor receptor in the brain for brain-derived neurotrophic factor can also be modulated by LSD and psilocybin. So that's a brand new discovery, just reported in the last month or so by a group at Hopkins. Very interesting work. We'll see, I'm sorry, it was a group from
Finland or
Finland. Yeah, Finland. Yeah. Very interesting results. This group had previously reported that antidepressant drugs like Prozac or fluoxetine also can activate this receptor. I would say which is interesting.
Yeah.
If true, of course, Prozac doesn't ameliorate depression in a single dose, right? So, and doesn't appear to have as robust effects as psilocybin. So it's sort of hard to square that with the idea that they both interact with the same site. And to my knowledge, no one has independently replicated those findings yet. So my lab, we're trying to replicate them now. We'll let people know in the next few months if we can replicate them. But pretty interesting if it's true. It's a really, really important finding. from both a positive and a negative perspective. Okay. The positive perspective is that here's a site for antidepressants, which is completely distinct from the psychedelic drug site. And if that's true, then we can easily make drugs that target that site. And they, by definition, they would not be psychedelic because they're not binding to the 5-HT2A receptor. The downside is that TrkB is found in every cell in the brain, including both neurons and glia. And there were previous trials with brain-derived neurotrophic factor as a therapeutic agent, which failed because of very severe side effects. So I'm guessing that we don't want to activate TrkB in every single cell in the brain. Probably not a good idea. We know if we activate TrkB outside the brain, then this is associated with increased risk of cancer. So the TrkB receptor is an important site for potential carcinogenesis, both inside the brain and outside. So if psychedelic drugs are having some off-target action at the TrkB receptor, that actually could be a bad thing long-term for psychedelics. I would say arguing against all of this is the fact that, humans have taken psychedelics since the 50s. There have been no reports of, tumors. We would have seen this in the epidemiologic literature by now. So I don't think that's a particular concern, but it will, it'll just be, it's like, it's one of these very interesting, novel, innovative findings. And we just need to see how reproducible this is yet. But I found the paper amazing, pretty cool paper. And I sent it around to everybody in my lab, and I said, we need to start studying this today. I put 3 people on the project. So it's pretty exciting, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I've been burned before in this area. Let me just put it that way.
Well, that's the beauty of investigating it and understanding it. And I think it speaks to the heart of so many people have had a transformative experience under psychedelics that was at times confrontational. And people believe that it's that confrontation or that transformative nature of confronting something that helps them overcome obstacles. And I think that when you read this paper coming out of Finland, it's trying to, in some ways, say, hey, let's take the magic out of the magic mushroom. Let's take the trip out of it. I think that's what people are kind of fighting against. What do you think? Yeah,
so a lot of people are trying to do that. So we have a big project that is funded by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to see if we can create drugs that are not psychedelic, but still activate the 5-HT2A receptor and have therapeutic benefits.
Why do they want to do that? I don't understand. Why?
I think, well, the reason is basic. I would say the reason is basically psychedelic drugs are not for, first of all, they're not for everybody.
True.
And you wouldn't want to give them to somebody in a battlefield situation. I think that would be like the worst.
Point taken, right?
Giving psychedelics to people with guns is probably the world's worst idea. The other thing is that many people probably should not take psychedelic drugs because they may have a history of they may have a history, or their family may have a history of severe psychiatric illness, sure, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And certainly if that's in your history, or if that's in your family history, you don't want to take psychedelics because of the risk that those could induce basically a psychotic state, or tip someone over into schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. There's a interesting first-person account I just read, I think was on Stat or one of those sites, or Wired, maybe it was on Wired, where somebody took psilocybin and had a manic episode and basically was ill for the next 2 years with bipolar disorder.
Wow.
So it really occurs. And as well, there are a vast number of people who don't want to take a psychedelic. So when I was practicing psychiatry, which I don't see patients anymore, many of my patients who suffered from depression basically they would come to me and they would say, just give me a pill to make me better, doc, basically. So they did not want to engage in psychotherapy or anything like that, and certainly did not want to have a guided mushroom trip. And finally, with psychedelic therapy, there is now the requirement to have qualified individuals there, basically before, during, and after the trip. And we'll never have enough qualified guides to treat the billion or so humans that are at risk for severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And so we really need, it's really important to see if we can harness the power of these medications without the psychedelic effects, just because there's so many humans, so many people that suffer from these severe disabling disorders that they're never going to be eligible, or they'll never have the resources for a guided psychedelic experience. In the state of Oregon, I think it's $2,800 for a guided experience, which, if you live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, or in, Pebble Beach or something like that, or Mission Bay in San Francisco, $2,800 is not a lot of money. If you're out here in rural Oregon, $2,800 is a lot of money.
Yeah, for a lot of people.
It's a lot of
money.
I
agree.
And so there is this other need, basically.
It seems to me that the millions of people that are depressed and facing this overwhelming trauma are a direct reflection of the people in charge. Like, maybe the people in charge took the mushrooms, they could have an effect, and then they could change the society we live in, right? Maybe the DARPA team should be doing the mushrooms.
Yeah. I think you should probably talk to Rick Doblin. So that's his vision.
I love it. Yeah, it's so. If I shift gears here for a minute, I was talking with a friend of mine, Yahim Fieber, and he's got a company called April 19th, and they use AI to create some new drug design. And he had a question that he wanted me to ask you. And the question is, which other receptors, like GPCRs, besides 5-HT2A, seem to contribute to the effects of psychedelics the most?
There aren't any. So there are drugs that are on the black market that are pretty selective for 5-HT2. So in the 5-HT2 family, there are 3 receptors, 2A, 2B, and 2C.
Okay.
The 2B is found in the heart. And drugs that activate it can cause valvular heart disease, which is a serious concern with psychedelics, which we can get to later. And the 2C has nothing to do with psychedelic drug action. It regulates feeding and things like that. And these drugs are psychedelic. They're, virtually indistinguishable from LSD when people take them. So the only thing I can say is that there are some other receptors that sort of negatively impact the psychedelic experience. So drugs like 5-methoxytryptamine. This is the drug that's found in toad skin.
5-MeO.
This apparently causes amnesia for the psychedelic experience, or at least partial amnesia. And we think that's due to its activity at 5-HT1A receptors, but I would say that's by no means definitive. So there are certainly other sites that these drugs hit that can attenuate the psychedelic experience. But I don't think there's any good data that interaction with any of these other receptors promotes the psychedelic experience. So it appears to be just 5-HT2A. And sort of related to this, there's a paper that was just published where people were given either LSD or psilocybin in a blinded fashion, and on 2 different occasions. And they were asked to distinguish, which one was LSD and which one was psilocybin. They couldn't tell the difference, basically. So the effects were, provided you give a sufficient dose, the effects are basically identical, with the caveat that the effects of LSD last longer than the effects of psilocybin. But they're virtually identical. DMT is sort of a different story. So if you read the first person accounts, people have, lots of people experience these spirits or entities or multidimensional machine elves, somebody calls them, under DMT. That appears to be somewhat unique to that. It could be just a pharmacokinetic thing, because DMT gets into the brain really quickly and activates the receptors almost instantaneously. We know from our work in mice that 5-HT2A blockers block all the effects of DMT. There have not been those studies in humans, so we probably should wait until we have the human studies. But there's really no good evidence that, at least in terms of the psychedelic action, that this is mediated by anything other than the 5-HT2A receptor.
Here's another one for you. There's a hypothesis that a metabolite of LSD, hydroxy-LSD, binds strongly to dopamine D2 receptors, which contributes to some negative effects of LSD. Have you found any evidence for this in your assays?
So LSD binds strongly to D2 receptors. So it's a really potent D2 agonist. It binds so tightly that we recently were able to solve a structure of the D2 receptor with LSD bound to it. So we haven't published it yet, but we have the structure.
Nice.
So I haven't looked at hydroxy LSD's pharmacology. Be interesting to look at that. But both LSD and psilocybin activate D2 receptors pretty potently. LSD a little bit better than psilocybin. So it's hard for me to believe that might be the case, but I mean, you never know until it's been studied in some detail.
Do you there is some, I was reading some theories about, and this was just in a magazine. I can't cite the paper. It's more anecdotal than anything. But there's been some research in some papers or magazines that I was reading where people are using like a nasal 5-MeO to help with dementia. Do you think in the future that there's potential for classic psychedelics to be used in aiding neurodegenerative diseases?
Yeah, we don't know until we have clinical trials, there aren't even animal studies yet suggesting the effect.
Right.
And I can just say 2 things about that. The first is that we know that psychedelic drugs induce plasticity in the brain, but this is a characteristic of all psychoactive drugs. So every psychoactive drug induces plasticity in some neural circuit to some extent or another. And psychedelics are no different or are not distinguished in that way from other drugs. But they do. The one thing that's sort of a little unusual about the psychedelic-induced plasticity is it occurs very quickly after psychedelic drug administration and is fairly long-lasting. And the same sort of plasticity that occurs with psychedelic drugs also occurs with antidepressants and drugs like ketamine, which are used to treat depression. And so we think that this plasticity may be important for potentially the therapeutic effects. And the question is, if you look at a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease or Niemann-Pick dementia, frontotemporal dementia, I mean, there are a ton of these diseases. If you enhance plasticity, is that going to be a good thing or a bad thing? And it's an interesting idea. We just don't know. I'm guessing not. That's my prediction. I'm guessing we're not going to use 5-methoxy-DMT to treat dementia. Just clinically, the last thing in the world you would want to do is give a psychedelic to somebody who's demented. It would be it's a really bad idea. Maybe 5-methoxy-DMT. For anybody who's contemplating 5-methoxy-DMT for dementia, what I recommend is you go to this TV series, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. Are you aware of this?
I am, yeah.
Okay, so he has a whole episode on 5-methoxy-DMT. And in this episode, you can watch him and his friend take 5-methoxy-DMT. And it is the most terrifying thing in the world I've ever seen. His friend basically is completely dissociated, rolling around on the ground, frothing at the mouth. And they were at this stream and they had to basically roll him out of the stream before he drowned. So and Hamilton Morris is just completely out of it, basically, when he takes it. So it's not like a benign drug. It looks pretty scary. And I've talked to people who've taken 5-methoxy-DMT. And this one guy basically said he thought he was dying, physically. It was a very, very frightening experience. It's an extremely intense experience. So I think the people that are studying this should talk to someone who's actually taken the drug. Then they may see how foolish this idea is. I think it's a very foolish idea. That being said, I have heard from my basic science colleagues that they're now seeing with some psychedelic drugs in mice models some evidence of I would say, beneficial plasticity in diseases in which there is diminished plasticity. Okay, so there might be something there, but I think for dementia, we need, with dementia, by the time people are demented, they've lost a significant number of neurons in the brain. Psychedelic drugs do not increase neurogenesis they do not enhance the number of new neurons that are being made, basically. So they're not going to grow you a new set of neurons. They may make the neurons that are there have more branches. Whether that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing in a demented brain is hard to say. But it might be for things like hearing loss or tinnitus or something like that. I would say mild hearing loss. Maybe COVID, people that are losing their taste, the sense of taste and smell with COVID might be, maybe I haven't heard anything yet, but that might be something you would think about. But dementia would not be the thing I would go after. I can give you a little more context on this.
Sure.
So for a number of years, I was an editor for the Journal of Clinical Investigation, which is, arguably the largest journal for sort of preclinical research. And I handled all the papers that were in the area of neurosciences. And at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, I would get a paper for a new drug that cured Alzheimer's disease in mice.
Mm.
Okay. So in my 5-year period, I saw maybe 500 papers that would cure, every one different. Okay. So I'm very skeptical about these sorts of things. There are tons and tons of interventions that will, ameliorate Alzheimer's disease or cognitive deficits in mice. None of them work in humans, basically. So we'll just have to see. But I'm for that particular application, I'm a bit skeptical. There are plenty of other good applications.
Have you seen any studies? It brings to me the idea that I wonder what happens in the brain at a near-death experience, because there's no shortage of people who've had this near-death experience and come out a changed person.
Yeah. So I had one.
Oh, do tell, my friend, if you don't mind.
It did not change me.
It had to change you a little bit, at least a little bit.
I don't think so. I'll just tell you what. Okay. I'll tell you what it was. So I was out. My brother is a trauma surgeon,
okay,
and also is in the active reserve of the Army. And in his Army career, he went through sort of Ranger training. And one night, when we were vacationing in Montana, he convinced me that the thing I should do was to do a midnight dive with him with scuba gear in this lake in Montana. And I did that, and I ran out of air, and it was dark, and he didn't see that I was out of air. And I kept going up to the surface to get air, and he kept pulling me down, basically, because he thought my ballasts were not working right. And he drowned me, basically. And just before, so I'd basically given up. And the only thought that came to mind was, my wife is going to be really pissed at me because she told me not to take that midnight dive. Because we were like 100 yards from the shore. And as I came up, I could see them there.
Right.
And I was thinking, oh, she's going to be really pissed. There wasn't any, my mind was very clear, very calm. There was no fear. It was just, this is a really stupid thing to do. I'm going to die out here, and my wife is going to be really pissed.
This is how it ends, I guess, right? Who knew?
But it sadly did not change me.
Interesting.
But other people report different things. I didn't see any tunnel of light. I was certain I was dead, basically. I didn't see any tunnel of light or anything like that. It was just sort of clear awareness. I practiced Zen.
Okay.
And it sort of was like a samadhi experience, basically. My mind was completely clear, everything was bright, but that was it. So,
like trying to drink the ocean through a fork.
Yes. Yeah, there is actually a Zen koan. Swallow the ocean in a single gulp.
Which your brother wanted you to do.
I was doing that,
yes. Let's say that there was a study in psychedelics that won the Nobel Prize. What would that be, do you think? Is there a study that could win the Nobel Prize in psychedelics?
I think, if they give a Nobel Prize for psychedelics, they should probably give it to Roland Griffiths and the group at NYU, because they discovered the therapeutic effects. They published these back-to-back papers in 2016. And that basically started the entire psychedelic renaissance. So before then, there was, no interest, literally no interest in psychedelic drugs therapeutically. And that really opened the floodgates. One One could also make the argument that the MAPS, this Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies that have brought forth MDMA, again, I was extremely skeptical that MDMA would be effective for anything. But if you look at the clinical trial data, the results are astounding.
Yeah.
I treated many people with PTSD when I was a resident, a psychiatry resident at Stanford. And there's nothing we could do for them. They were, they had, these were mainly Vietnam veterans, experienced the most horrific things. I mean, you cannot imagine what they've experienced. And in many cases, through no fault of their own. They were just passive bystanders, and something blew up and their friend was completely obliterated, basically. And it was clear to me that we didn't have anything to offer them. The best we could help them with was we could give them certain types of antidepressants which would suppress their ability to have dreams, so they wouldn't dream at night, basically. But that was basically it. And then I saw the results, the phase 3 trial results with ecstasy, published in Nature Medicine, I think 3 years ago. Amazing. Unbelievable, basically.
Yeah.
And I've subsequently heard from many veterans who contacted me by email and elsewhere that these drugs are extremely effective for treating PTSD in the right setting. So I think MAPS gets a huge slice of that as well. Those would be if the Nobel committee asked me to nominate somebody, those would be the people I would nominate. I mean, we would not be where we are today if it wasn't for those 3 organizations. Yeah.
When you see the research like that on MDMA and what it's done for people, doesn't it make you curious to want to try it?
Yeah, I thought about it. It's illegal, right?
In some places.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we could find a location it's not, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I was curious about is what an authentic rave experience would be like. So I've talked to lots and lots of people in the rave culture, and they describe a really intensely ecstatic and spiritual experience. And I thought that might be interesting to try. If it was legal, and if my physician said it would be safe for me to take. Ecstasy is not without its side effects. So,
sure.
What's called hyperpyrexia, which is, increased temperature, fainting, and so on. It's rare, but there are people that die from ecstasy.
Sure.
If they're not in a coolish environment, basically. So that's the only one that sort of piqued my curiosity. Not enough to really try it, but it's intriguing to me. Luckily I don't have any post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms of any sort. I think it would have been useful for me when I was a medicine trainee. In that era, we had it was in the era before cell phones, and we had beepers, basically pagers. And when we were on call, the pager would go off, right? And immediately my heart would start racing. I would get so I sort of had like mild PTSD for the sound of beepers, pagers. So it might have been useful back then, but I don't have anything that would be, that would make it necessary for me to take ecstasy. How about yourself? Have you ever thought about taking ecstasy? You have.
I've taken a bunch of it. I've been pretty well versed with psychedelics. I've taken mushrooms, LSD, a bunch of the analogs like FLAD, ecstasy. I've tried a host of recreational drugs, and I've found that they have been really phenomenal in helping me work through my trauma. Obviously, I've used them in a recreational form, but as I've gotten older, like I've really used, I'll give you an example. I've been a UPS driver. I was a UPS driver for 26 years. And in there, you know, I found myself at a state after my son died where I was really angry for a while. And there was a guy at my work and I was really mean to him all the time, but I thought I was just joking with him. I would say things like, oh, you're a big baby, or, you know, you're really weak. But I would say mean things to him.
That's pretty mean.
And it was way worse than that. But here I am, my ego in check, trying to be all cool guy, you know, and my friend pulls me aside and he goes, George, you're being a real dick to that guy. And I was like, you think so? And he's like, yeah, that's why I'm telling you, man. And I remember I that weekend I did a big dose of mushrooms, and I thought to myself, like, why am I being so mean to that guy? And it hit me in like a 1-2 punch. The first punch was, you don't like him because he's weak. And the second punch instantly is like, no, you're weak. And he reminds you you're weak. And I went, oh, geez, I get goosebumps when I think about it, you know? And I was like, oh my God. And then of course I had to go apologize to him and be like, you know, I just wanted to apologize. I've been really mean and disrespectful to you. And I hope you'll accept my apology. You're a great person. I'm really weak and I'm working on some things. And I want to thank you because you showed me that I'm weak, man. And I'm sorry, you know, but I would have never had, I may not have had that insight for a long time or ever had I not been in a heightened state of awareness or in a state which that could have, what I could have thought. I saw myself in almost a third person point of view. And that seems to be something that is pointed out in different types of PTSD treatments. When I read about other people, when I talk about people that go and have these experiences, that seems to be something that's repeated, maybe not in that exact form, but they're seeing themselves in a third person point of view. On the topic of ecstasy.
Ibogaine seems to be have a specific activity for that. At least from what I've read, there are reports of people basically experiencing what they did to other people. From the other person's perspective. Basically. And that, as you imagine, that is extremely powerful, right? Extremely powerful. Yeah.
Well, think about that from a doctor's point of view. Like, if you have that experience, then I think you'll be able to better not only diagnose the person that may have something, but you'll have a real empathy with that person. I think that it enhances your relationship with the patient in a weird sort of way.
Yeah, it may. And, you know, everything you say is very intriguing and consistent with what many, many people have told me, basically. And so I don't, you know, I think it's pretty clear that in the right circumstances, these drugs can be, you know, quite useful. I like to call them medications now rather than drugs.
Agreed.
Because they're under investigation by the FDA as medication. And I think the challenge going forward will be to find the right patient cohorts for them, the right therapists, and the right indications. But yeah, I mean, this is what I hear. It's particularly powerful talking to veterans who have, you know, gone on ayahuasca journeys or ibogaine journeys. They have very powerful experiences as well. Very, you know, in some ways very similar, and end up with, you know, an acceptance and a lightening of that load. For myself, since we're into anecdotes, I practice Zen.
Right.
Okay. And for a number of years, for decades, basically, I had some issues with my father. You know, typical. I would say more extreme than sort of typical. I was in psychoanalysis as part of my training, you know, to deal with this. And the amazing, so I go to these Zen retreats several times a year. And I remember after a particular Zen retreat, I came out of the retreat basically, and the anger was gone. It had totally disappeared, completely gone. And I basically called up my parents in the next few days and expressed my gratitude to them.
Yeah.
For their help,
right?
Basically,
Nice.
I think they thought I had gone crazy. But the thing that's interesting to me is that during that retreat, and actually during all my Zen retreats, my father has never came up for me. Okay. So it wasn't like I had a hallucination of my father during the retreat. It's just that it just fell away, basically. So I think what this indicates to me is that there may be other approaches, which do not rely on this, basically the psychedelicized experience that might be the same. The downside with Zen is it takes about 30 years of training, so it takes a long time. It's not particularly user friendly.
Yeah. Any heightened state of awareness, right? Like anytime you're able to find yourself in a different state of awareness, you can see yourself in the situation, the world around you differently. It's a shifting of perspective. And I think the psychedelics, they rocket you to that. If you don't understand, if you're getting rocketed to this new space, it could be scary. But it's like any environment you're in, whether you're at a Zen retreat on day 5, it may take 25 years for you to get comfortable in the environment before you can explore it. The same goes with a psychedelic substance. You may have to go on a few journeys before you become comfortable with the environment, and you can begin picking things up and being, oh, well, that's my relationship, or hey, that's me being a knucklehead, or
I just, getting back to this, I recently was at a scientific meeting, and one of my colleagues who suffers from severe depression he came to me, and he looked different.
Nice.
And he's somebody my age, basically. And he said he went on a guided psilocybin experience, and he said it was amazingly effective, basically. This was a guy no way I would ever have. So he went to a regular therapist, and it was in a place that is legal, basically. But interestingly, he said that the integration is the most difficult for him. The integration after the experience has been the most powerful.
How does he define integration? Like, what does that mean?
I didn't get into that with him.
Right.
I didn't discuss what his issues were. I was just happy to see that he had a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye.
He looked different, you said. That's great.
He looked different. There was no question. I could see it immediately. Yeah.
You could see it. Tangible.
Yeah. There was no question.
This is going to sound crazy, but I'm going to say it. I think if you did a large dose of psilocybin, the direction of your research would change dramatically.
I've been studying psychedelics since 1983.
I know, and I don't mean that in a bad way at all. I'm just saying I think it would. I know it, and please forgive me for saying something like that, but I have to say it. Like, I think it would fundamentally change.
So you don't know anything.
I don't know crap, man.
You don't know anything about my past. Let me just put it that way.
Okay, I don't. And I mean, no disrespect there, but maybe you can share some with me.
I'm not going to get into anything in my past, but let me just say that my interests always have been how drugs are acting at the most fundamental level, and I've always wanted to study psychedelics. Basically, I'll just put it there. Put it out there like that.
Right.
And, we all have our own interests.
Absolutely.
Every mind is different. We all have our own interests and our own opportunities and potentialities. And the way my mind works, the research that I do is the best thing for me to do. I'll just put it that way. Okay.
Yeah, I'm stoked you do it. It's fascinating.
And no one else is doing it, basically.
Yeah.
So for years, I had the only grant to study LSD. Literally the only NIH grant to study LSD up until about 3 or 4 years ago. So I was the only person, almost the only person in the world that was studying these drugs at a fundamental level. And we don't know anything about how these drugs act in the brain. And that's what I'm really, I think that's where I can make the biggest impact. There are tons and tons of psychologists and therapists that are looking at the sort of transpersonal and transformative aspects of these, and that's fine. Right. They can do that. I'm best at sort of more basic research, and that's where I should be, basically.
So that brings up once something attaches to the 2A receptor, is it just a level of cascading events after that? Is that when the incoherence comes in? Like, do we know what happens after that, or like? So
we don't really know. That's one of the big things we're trying to find out. I can tell you what we think. I can tell you what my current understanding is. Okay.
Please.
So the 5-HT2A receptors are found in the cortex. So who is the audience for this? Let me just, so I know how to explain things.
It's a wide range of, I have a lot of people on LinkedIn that are doctors and psychologists, but then there's also a lot of recreational users like me, or people that enjoy listening to psychology. So you have a wide swath. So I would bring it down to about a level 5.
I'll try to bring it down. Yes. So in the cortex, that's the part of the brain that we think with and gives us a perspective of reality. That's where these receptors are the most highly enriched. And when LSD binds these receptors, it causes the neurons to fire in a very disorganized fashion.
Okay.
So it basically injects noise in the system. So what you have is that the part of the brain that's most critically involved in giving us our view of reality, there's now noise like this in it.
Okay.
And we think that is what caused, our best guess is that is what causes the psychedelic experience. They're no longer, the mind can no longer trust the external cues. And so now it turns its awareness into experiences that are derived internally from the cortex. Okay. And what you see concomitantly is that in the visual cortex, so the area of the brain that's responsible for seeing the world, that gets shut down to some extent, because people are now basically focusing on internally derived visual stimuli. Okay, whirls and things like this. And then the mind begins to create a narrative. And the narrative, for reasons that are not understood at all, well, we don't know why it creates a narrative, but it does. Talk to anybody who takes a psychedelic. There's a narrative, right?
Right.
There's a story. That is imparted with tremendous meaning and significance. Okay.
Right.
And that's very peculiar for psychedelics. So marijuana, people who smoke marijuana, they don't say, I smoked this joint and I had this transformative experience. They don't say
it. They don't say it. I know.
They don't say that. People who take crack cocaine don't say that.
Nope.
People who drink alcohol don't say that. but people that take psychedelics say that. So that's very, very interesting to me. And it's due to the drug, right? Because you didn't have that experience before you took the drug. You only had the experience when you took the drug. So the drug is doing something in the brain that's, creating this narrative and giving it tremendous significance and also relevance for your life.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't have the foggiest idea what's going on. And so at this meeting, I gave a talk I was the keynote speaker. I gave a talk on psychedelics, and I said, as part of my talk, I said, we don't have any idea what's going on here. And my friend who had taken psilocybin said, you're right, we don't have any idea. So we don't have the foggiest idea what the heck is going on. And I think it would be useful to understand that, right?
Yeah.
If these medications are going to be approved and used by, millions and potentially billions of people, it would be quite useful to understand how they work in the brain, right? So that's what I'm focused on.
Do you have any I know doctors and scientists aren't supposed to speculate. Do you have any ideas of what you think may be happening?
No, I don't. I'm quite perplexed. And so the technical term for meaning is what's called salience. So there's this term called salience.
Okay.
And so psychedelic experiences are filled with salience.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to the people that study salience, they tell me I need to study the locus coeruleus and norepinephrine neurons. And I say to them, well, psychedelics don't affect the locus coeruleus or norepinephrine neurons. And they said, well, it can't be salience. Then I said, well, it is. There's no question. So this it's a completely different sort of uncharted territory. We don't, this is one of the reasons I find it really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Because, it's sort of like if you go back to the 1800s when explorers were, exploring the Amazon, and everywhere they looked, there was a new species of bird or a new species of insect that they could name. That's sort of where we are in terms of psychedelics. We're in the dark ages in terms of understanding them. And, it's just a really exciting time. So.
See, it seems to me on some level, like I think that idea of meaning stems from language. Like, it seems to me the reason why you have such a powerful experience and it's a connection and meaningful to you as an individual on psychedelics is because for the first time in 50 or 40 or 30 years, you have the ability to reimagine everything. And if you just think about the way we're taught, like the phonetic alphabet in the world, the way we process information, you see something and all of a sudden you're given the title of that. That's a bird. I'll give you an example. Like, let's say you're a baby, you're 2 years old and a bird flies into your room. And as a child, you're like, look at this magical flying beast flapping its wings. And your mom comes in and says, George, that's a bird. That's a bird, George. Okay, that's just taken everything away from me and it's given me bird. That process has gone on for 50 years. And when you take a psychedelic, that phonetic alphabet, the separation, the idea of exact repeatability is gone. And now you as an individual for the first time in 50 years are seeing something and giving it the meaning that you want to it. Like, that is an experience of a godlike experience, right?
Yeah.
Is that too crazy?
Yeah. So it's, many people have these experiences where they're an omniscient experience or where they are the universe, right?
Right. Yes.
Where there's no separation between them and the universe. When they breathe in, the universe breathes in. When they breathe out, the universe breathes out. I have the same experience when I practice Zen. I'm just not having a psychedelic experience. So I completely get what you're talking about, and it's marvelous, right?
Yes.
It's more
than that.
It's a marvelous, wonderful experience to hear a bird for the first time, to really hear a bird, to hear just the sound of the bird, right? Just the bird, or just see the bird. Where you and the bird are one with the universe. It's It's wonderful. It's transformative. How could you ever hurt a bird after that, right?
Yeah.
Right. How could
Of
you
course.
ever squash an insect after you've had that experience? So I'm with you. The thing I'm a little cautious about, though, is that I grew up sort of the tail end of the 60s,
Mm.
and many people I knew took psychedelics. Virtually everybody I knew took psychedelics at
Right.
one time or another, and had, peak psychedelic experiences. There was tons of LSD around. It was reasonably pure. Many of these people are now Trump supporters. So I grew up.
Don't eat the brown acid.
I grew up in
Right?
Montana. I grew up in a small town in
Okay.
Montana. Okay.
Okay.
LSD made it to Montana.
Right.
And I was on Facebook recently, and a lot of these old hippies are now huge Trump supporters. It's like the most, and anti-gay, So it's, if you were to talk to them in the 60s or 70s, they were very liberal, open-minded people. But it didn't last forever. Okay. It lasted, probably for a year or so, and then at most, and then they were basically who they were. So that's you see these things. A lot of people report these things. So many people took LSD in the 60s that we should now have an enlightened society, right? Right? All those boomers.
I don't know.
All those boomers took LSD. There were tons of them. Maybe 1 million boomers took LSD.
I think it's
Boomers
a
are the biggest
relationship. Yeah.
Trump supporters now. So this is the pushback I give people, that if you look at long term, okay, unless maybe people need to take a booster once a year. I
think it needs to be a relationship for life with it.
Yeah. So, but a single dose or a few doses just doesn't lead to any long-term transformation. I can sort of give you 2 anecdotes about that.
Sure.
That you might find interesting.
Of course.
In Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs,
Bill Wilson.
they warn about this, basically, that early in the program you're going to see big changes. But they say it's a lifetime journey, and one of the ways they say that is a jerk or an asshole. Basically, an asshole gets on the plane in Chicago, and an asshole gets off the plane in Detroit. Right? Okay, so you can have this wonderful experience. You're still basically the same. You may still be the same person, and you need to guard against that. The other thing was, so Mountain Girl. You've heard of Mountain Girl, right?
It sounds familiar, but maybe I can't quite think what it is. Maybe you could flesh it out for me.
I think that was Jerry Garcia's second wife.
Okay.
And she was also one of the first Merry Pranksters with Ken Kesey.
Okay, right? Cuckoo's Nest. One flew over the Cuckoo's Nest.
So she lives in Oregon. She lives outside Eugene. I just read she's pretty famous in the psychedelic community, very famous in the I'm a Grateful Dead fan, so all us Grateful Dead fans know who Mountain Girl is. She said she takes psilocybin once a year. And this guy who wrote which I'm not recommending this, I'm just,
right. Just telling a story.
That's what she says. She takes it once a year to reconnect, basically reorient. And this guy, Tom Robbins, this famous author who wrote all these marvelous books, Another Roadside Attraction, I think, was one of his big books. he lives or lived in the Northwest and took mushrooms once a year, basically. So my guess is for really, long-term transformation, probably you need to be in psychotherapy, practice Zen, group therapy. I'm not going to recommend taking psychedelics regularly because we just don't know what the ramifications are for that. But that's my pushback, is that the enduring effects on personality don't appear to be that enduring for the vast majority of people. This was noticed in the 60s when they did studies on LSD and psilocybin. People who are alcoholic initially would have a period of abstinence, and then, unless they were in a 12-step program, basically would start drinking again. So there needs to be something, I think for most people, there would need to be something added to that. I don't think it's going to be like, take 5 grams of mushrooms, call me in the morning and all your problems will be gone forever. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah. From what I have read about some of the beneficial effects and that I have experienced, is that it seems to me psychedelics help you confront an issue, where in the world of addiction, people are running from an issue. People will drink alcohol to get away or not think about their problems. They'll do cocaine to get away from these things. But it seems in a psychedelic experience, there's nowhere to run, that the problem is in front of you, but not so much in a way where you can't deal with it. It's in a manner that's like, what if I did this? Or I'm kind of being a knucklehead, and it's almost like a friendly exchange between a different version of yourself and the truth, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's dependent on the person, right?
Good point. Of course.
Yeah. So, people with that are insufficiently integrated, maybe they have a severe personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. It would be pretty problematic for them to have that experience. And one can imagine, well, I've met people who have quote unquote bad trips. And I think that's why all the regulatory agencies, so the FDA basically recently issued a guidance on psilocybin and other psychedelics, and they part of the FDA recommendations is there need to be guides. So everything you say is certainly consistent with things I've heard from many, many other people, but I would caution listeners here not to do this on your own. Ideally, if you can make it out to Oregon, make it out to a licensed practitioner, a licensed therapist, somebody who's gone through the training and has experience. Don't if you're a teenager, don't have 2 of your friends sit with you. Probably not a good idea. Certainly everything you say is possible. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, Brian, I sometimes, like when I read some of the literature about people finding novel ways to solve problems or having that aha moment that we talked about, sometimes they find themselves out in nature and they're studying things. And there's a weird similarity that I think a lot of people have noticed, that if you look at certain types of mycelium, which is like the fungal growth of the mushrooms, and you can see how they move through the root structures of trees, they're providing nutrients to different parts of the root structures. And it seems that is what happens in the synaptic activity of our brain when we consume mushrooms, that it's moving energy around, or dendritic spines are moving back and forth and changing shape. It just seems like there's a pattern there. And maybe it's because I'm seeing patterns where there aren't any patterns, but can it be as above, so below? Like, could we study what's happening in mushrooms below ground to see maybe what's happening in our brain when we take fungus like that? Or is that too far out there?
I've heard a lot of people say these things. What I what I reply is DMT doesn't come from a mushroom.
All right.
Okay. LSD does not come from a mushroom. And people have the same experience. So I don't think it's the mushroom itself, it's the drug. But MDMA, ecstasy also, from what I've heard, improves, people have this sense of communion, right?
Yeah.
MDMA is an entirely synthetic molecule. So it's an interesting idea. There are lots of mushrooms, all mushrooms
Right.
are mycelia. They don't all give us there's only a few that give us a psychedelic experience. A lot of them are poison.
Right.
Some, cause a dissociative experience like Amanita muscarina. So yeah, I think it's an interesting story. It's helpful to people. It's fine, but I don't, I've heard this before.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a story. So
Right.
it's again one of these stories the mind makes up, and
the storytelling. Yeah,
it makes up a story. This guy who coined the term multidimensional machine elves,
Terence McKenna.
Terence McKenna. Yeah, he has. I urge people to listen to him on YouTube. You only have to listen to a couple of his talks before you get the entire message. But he has this strange idea that mushrooms are like an alien life form and communicating with us. Anything is possible. I think they're just psychedelic mushrooms. It's
right. Yeah, I think it was almost harkening back to Francis Crick's idea of panspermia. How like all of a sudden there's spores that come from another planet, and I don't know. There's some fascinating, fun ideas to think about that could be possible. And I don't know. Here's one about an addiction that I was thinking about. It's weird how in the world of addiction we see the treatment for that is almost to give somebody another medicine that keeps them addicted. And as a psychiatrist, it's so weird that how I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I would like to get your opinion on. It seems that we as humans have used that in the business world. And I'll give you the idea of like toner. Like you can buy a copier from Xerox and they'll give you the copier for almost nothing, but then you got to buy the toner. It kind of seems like they've harnessed the addictive model of drugs, or is that just a scaffold that we humans move towards? It's weird how that permeates both sides of us, though, right? Like it's in business and it's in addiction. It's something that we do, maybe.
Yeah. So I've heard this sort of argument before from people about all sorts of things in medicine.
Okay.
And I can only speak of my experience as a physician. And the experience of people I know very well as physicians. Our goal is to help people.
Yes.
And I also know people that work in the pharmaceutical industry, and their goal is to make a medicine that makes a difference for people. That's their goal.
Absolutely.
Secondarily, to make money. And with treating addiction, it's a really complicated thing. So there's physical addiction, and frequently the best thing you can do for the patient for the individual where they are in their lives at that period of time is decrease their craving for the addictive substance so that they no longer engage in the really terrible things that they're doing to themselves and to others to maintain their addiction. And I don't think any physician that specializes in addiction disorders would say that their goal is to get them addicted to. So if they're a heroin addict, to get them addicted to methadone. That's not the goal. Goal is to get them off and have them lead the life they want to lead. But that's not possible for everybody. For a whole host of reasons. Sometimes we don't have the support systems in place. Right. We don't invest any money in community mental health or community substance abuse centers. And we don't see it as a priority in our country. And I think what we really need is we as a society need to have a change in our hearts inside, so that we can connect with people and help them out. And until we're in sort of this, what I call an alternative Canadian universe, orthogonal to our particular universe, right? Or alternative Netherlands universe, or whatever, Swedish universe. Take right. Your pick. We're not going to get there. And I don't know of any physician that thinks it's a good outcome that the person is now on bupropion, or buprenorphine. Versus heroin. Okay, so buprenorphine is now given a lot to diminish cravings for opiates and right. help the recovery process. Nobody sees that as a final solution. It's a step. It's a step in the direction of recovery, and we just don't have blame it on your congressman. We don't have anybody that, we don't have any advocates out there for people with severe substance abuse and mental illnesses in this country. And it would be great if we, lived in a society where everybody could have access to an addiction recovery network. We don't have that here. That's what we need. The medications are effective. They're not, they're not the final situation. And I actually don't know. I know of no physician that would say, yeah, I'm just giving this to make. I mean, there are physicians out there that have, prescription pill mills in their office, but the vast majority of us out there, we're confronted with literally an unending stream of human suffering every day entering our doors. And what we want to do is to diminish that suffering in some way. And if the only intervention we can give is a pill, that we give that basically. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And try to do our best, but it's, we live in an imperfect world, sadly. And so we have to just take advantage of the tools that are currently available. I think in the future, psychedelic medicines may be an instrument in the armamentarium. Certainly what I hear from individuals who have taken ibogaine, who are heroin addicts or fentanyl addicts, many people find after that the strength to leave that all behind. And it would be wonderful if we had some sort of treatments where everybody that came in the door, we could say, well, here's a prescription. Here's, Joe and Sally, they'll be your guides, basically. Yeah. And they're going to take you through a guided experience. And then we have a whole program afterwards for, integration and aftercare and maybe booster sessions at some time in the future. We don't have that right now. And so we just have to do what we can with what we have.
It seems like one of the biggest problems with trying to get new technologies or new drugs to market is like the clinical trial process. Do you think that maybe in the future we'll see like a way to streamline that? Like James Fadiman has like the Fadiman protocol where he had everybody send in I forgot the exact amount of people he had, but he sent it out to the public, kind of farmed it out a little bit. Please send in the dosage you're taking, what you're taking it for. And he created like this large swath of almost a survey type of protocol where people sent stuff in. And I realize it's not that accurate. And you're not controlling for all these variables. But might it be a way in the future to help bring clinical trials down? Or is there a way to restructure that to get the price down on clinical trials?
I
know I'm way out there, man, but I don't know. I'm stoked to talk to you, Bryan.
Clinical trials. Yeah, that's the issue with clinical trials is they need to be designed in a way in which you get an unambiguous answer at the end, right? You want a definitive answer. The way basically the gold standard are these placebo-controlled, double-blind, large phase 3 trials. This has been modified somewhat over the years, primarily from AIDS activists and cancer activists, so that there are sort of alternative ways of doing things. But until we come, I'm open, I don't do clinical trials, but I think the regulatory, I'm sure the regulatory agencies would be overjoyed to find something that's more effective, faster, cheaper than our current way of doing things.
Yeah.
The problem that they run into is that they have to certify that the drug is safe and effective. And, the worst thing possible would be to have a bunch of things on the market that are simply not safe. Right. I mean, if they're not effective, it's not a huge, it's bad for the patient, but it's not going to cause, quote unquote, cause them any harm. It's not going to hurt them in any way. But, serious side effects. I recall the fen-phen thing many years ago.
Yeah.
We don't want to have something like that again. That was disastrous. Thalidomide, the same thing. So it's a balancing act. I just say sometimes. So I have friends that work for the FDA, people from my lab that used to be in my lab, and again, their goal is, to make sure we have safe and effective medications. That's their goal. They don't have any alternative
motivations or
motivation. Yeah. Right. That's all they want. And we just don't right now. We just don't have anything that gives unambiguous conclusions similar to a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which is going to cost a couple $100 million, basically. Man. They're extremely expensive to do. So,
right.
That's where we are.
That is. Bryan, I got to say, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Sure.
I really enjoyed talking to you. This is really fun.
Yeah, it was great.
And before I let you go, though, where can people find you? Where can they check out some of the things that you're doing at the lab?
So the easiest thing is just to Google me. And I think my Wikipedia page comes up and you can get links from there.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best way. Or people can email me. I get emails all the time. Just go to Wikipedia. It will eventually get you to my email address, and then you can send me an email. And I reply to them all. Nice. Even if my reply is, I know nothing about this, I can't help you, but here's somebody that really knows something about it.
That's so awesome. It's so awesome to get to talk to somebody who's on the forefront of and been on the forefront for so long, that cares about making the world a better place and is willing to talk to people. So I'm truly thankful for that.
Sure.
And hang on one second. I'm going to hang up with the people, but I want to talk to you briefly afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for today. I hope you all have a beautiful day. It's Monday. I want to tell everybody out there, listen to the voice in your heart and follow it. And things will always get better if you have patience. So that's all I got for today. Ladies and gentlemen, aloha.